What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Long Haul Mentality. I'm your host, as always, Nick Bagley, and today I've got my friend Rachel Sedwick with me, IFBB Pro in figure. How are you this morning?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad you took some time. I've had a lot of men on the podcast so far, so it's time to get a female in here.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I do the same with mine, just trying to get like a good mix of people on. So
Yeah, for sure. So we kind of already discussed it a little bit before we got started, but the main thing that I'm focusing on with the podcast is like the mental side of bodybuilding, because like we hear the X's and O's talked about all the time with training and nutrition and all that stuff. But I think a more important aspect a lot of people kind of either don't touch on enough or just don't really focus too much on is the mental side of things. And um, the reason I wanted to talk to you specifically is I have been focusing on learning more about coaching females in the last year or two. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed is that a lot of times people treat female competitiveness as if they're small men, right? And the timeline with everything has to be so much different with females just because of y'all's physiology. And when was like obviously you competed last year. Prior to that, when was your first show or your show before that?
So I competed in 2021. I did 3 shows that year, one in July, and then I took a little bit of time and then pushed for 2 shows in November that year. So I competed like, I think November 20th or something like that in 2021. And then I switched coaches right after that season. And we spent 22, 23, and like half of 24 almost, because I started prep in May of 2024. So I took like 2.5 years off before I started prep for 2024.
And what was the main reason for taking that much time off?
I needed to do a lot. Like I needed to grow. That was like the biggest thing. A little background on me. I got my pro card in 2017, which now is like feels so long ago. Um, but I got my pro card naturally, and I then went on to do 2 pro seasons, 2019 and then again in 2021. So not a ton of time off. I think just a little over a year off for both the pro debut off season and then the next off season. Um, and I did those both of those preps naturally and just learned a lot about myself and a lot about the capabilities of athletes and like of our bodies and things like that. Learn a lot more about coaching and whatnot. And so for me, I realized that if I don't want to get last place again, because that's what I got every single pro show that I did up until that point. I needed to do like a lot of things differently. And so part of that was just giving full like drive and like give the roadmap to my coach. And so my
Right.
coach, Mark Tominick, is has been really, really great for that, because that's the type of coach he is. He's not like, oh, I'm just gonna let the coach kind of coach or the client coach themselves. So I really needed just more direction from my coach. And that meant like giving up the timeline, just saying like I'll do whatever I'm supposed to do when I'm ready, like when he says I'm ready. And so it was just like dropping the ego to allow myself to grow, but also like transfer into like the enhanced athlete space, which I had never done before as an athlete. And then that just took time to grow, but also grow in a way that like kept my own priorities in check, like of keeping my femininity and staying healthy and just like everything that you want to have as a priority in an off season.
Right, 100%. And I wanted to ask you that question because I knew it was going to touch on some of the points that we could talk on today. And kind of like I alluded to in the beginning, is there's a lot of coaches who are treating females just like they're small men, meaning
Mm-hmm.
we can still have the same timeline, we can still diet you as aggressively, we can push compounds like not at the same level, but like you can kind of take whatever with no real regard to like the natural ebb and flow of your regular hormones.
Yeah.
um, so the first thing I want to touch on is like you turned pro naturally as a figure competitor,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right?
At MPC Nationals.
So, like, obviously, not everyone is going to be able to do that, especially with the level of bodybuilding that we have today. But I think a very important thing to touch on there is there are way too many females who are jumping the gun on when they're hopping on anabolics,
Absolutely.
and the stuff that I have seen come out of even the bikini division of like what girls are taking is just absolutely ridiculous. And it's like, you haven't even been on stage yet, and you're already taking something that like an Olympian would take, that's going into like a high muscular division like figure physique or bodybuilding. And they don't understand. Typically they're younger, right? When they decide to do this, they're in their teens to early 20s, and they don't really fully understand how that stuff is going to impact them long term. So they're jumping the gun on doing these things. So I think it's I didn't even know that you had turned pro naturally, because I think we actually met after your first run of shows in I think towards the end of 21 or 22. So it was like after you were already pro when we originally met. So I
Yeah.
didn't know any of that, but the main point I want to highlight from that is just like, for any females out there, spend some time staying natural and see what you can do there before you cross that bridge. Is that kind of how you typically manage your females?
Yeah, it is, and that's how I thought of it when I first started competing. My first show was in 2015, and I didn't do awesome, but I just fell in love with the sport, and I was a personal trainer at the time. I was, like, really into the gym life and competitor life, and then I did that show naturally, right? And so, at the time, I knew a little bit about how, like, oh, yeah, some people take steroids, right? But I wasn't, like, I knew that since I didn't know enough about it, I didn't want to go that route yet, especially because, like, okay, I didn't check all my boxes in that first prep. Like, I cheated on my diet a few times. I didn't have a great coach. Like, certain things just were not checked off. And so I felt like, well, what if I had a better coach and I adhered to my diet and I followed a better training program? What if I checked those boxes off first and then see where I go from there, and just continue to see what my capacity is like and what my potential is like naturally before adding in this whole other layer. And that's kind of what I recommend for people to do, is like build up your maturity level first. Because
Mhm.
if you can't follow your diet, if you can't follow a training program, if you're like having to motivate yourself to go to the gym instead of just going because you go and going because it's a thing that you do out of discipline and enjoyment, then I don't think you're ready for steroids. Like, you're
That's
just not.
that's
And
such a
so,
level of self-awareness that you just don't see anymore. Like
yeah, and
for
I
you.
think part of it is self-awareness, but also part of it is, like, so many people get into the sport and they're very heavily influenced by people. Like, we have social media, it's at such a different level than it was when I first started competing.
Same,
And you
yeah.
have coaches, like, way more online coaches now than there was in 2015. Like, that was not as much of a
Right,
thing back then, honestly. So now we're
right.
10 years later and people are influenced by influencers on Instagram, coaches, influencer coaches that aren't really coaches, they're just influencers, and Reddit, and like, all there's so much information, and most of that information points to the direction of you need drugs and you need them now because you need to go pro now.
It's
But
just
like,
it's the cool
you're
thing to
in your
post about.
20s, you don't need to go pro right now.
Right. It's the cool thing to post about, because like just talking about like, oh, you train really well, you're eating really well, this is how you eat food, this is how you do cardio, like that shit's boring. People
Yeah.
want to hear that like you have some hidden thing that they're unaware of,
Mhm.
right? Which is really unfortunate, because like that is the landscape of what gets attention online. So like even coaches I know are good coaches, some of them will go on and talk about these compounds. And of course, that stuff is going to get them attention. And without the context to the individual, it can be very like, oh, well, I should definitely do that. Like I'm sure, like, I don't know about you, but like with a lot of the inquiries I get, especially with kids who are like in their early 20s and teens and stuff, it's like they've barely been lifting like a year or two, and they want to ask me like, how should they run trend? And I'm like, don't. You should run from trend. Like
Yeah.
get that. Don't get that idea out of your head, and like let yourself develop in this. And like I just did a video on mental discipline. like develop a level of mental discipline around your diet, around your training, around your cardio, around all these other aspects of things before you add that extra step in. Because if you're not already disciplined to begin with, just because you put a needle in your ass doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden going to develop the natural ability to stick to everything. And you cannot expect to just get the physique you want just because you fucking took a compound, and that goes even extra for females,
Yeah, definitely. Especially because one thing people don't always think about when they're either a coach starting a female on a drug or drugs, or if you're just an athlete wanting to start PEDs of any kind, is like your body as a female is less resilient to the negative side effects of drugs. And so like while a male can kind of fuck his hormones up or, go too hard on a cycle or something and mess with his health a little bit, it's going to be a lot easier for him to bounce back from that and come through relatively unscathed.
100%.
Whereas with a female, it's not like that. A lot of side effects
100%.
are long lasting or forever. A lot of like hormonal dysfunction that can come from going on a cycle and not having it be like monitored properly or executed properly in like a health focused way. That could take years to correct. Like
I
it's
mean,
just, and it's not to scare people away from it, because I think that there are a lot of really great coaches and people who use much safer practices with PEDs, but it's why you should interview your coaches. It's why you should take your time and learn how to be a good athlete first before jumping into that, because you do need to build up your self-awareness. You do need to build up your maturity, your training intensity, your intention, your purpose, so that you're not in this sport as like such a new athlete and you're, really deep into, being an enhanced athlete at that, while you haven't even taken the time to see if you like the sport yet, much less
100%.
see if it's worth it to go through possible negative side effects that could be forever.
Right. And even for the females out there that aren't ever thinking about getting on gear, something to think about here is like one of the hardest things for females to come back from is taking birth control, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like so many females are getting on birth control at such a young age and then taking it for years on end. And then that in and of itself, like even though your doctor recommended it to you, more than likely it is a hormonal product. More than likely they gave you something that has estrogen, progesterone, that kind of thing, whatever. Even coming off of that can be an absolute nightmare, right?
Oh
Like
yeah, that
I
can
have
take years to get your natural cycle back.
exactly. And like the thing that Corey Hageman and I talked about is like just because you have your cycle back doesn't necessarily mean that you're in a good spot. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that you are now fertile. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that you are actually legitimately having the ebbs and flows the way you need. It could still be disrupted. And if we're talking about something that is prescribed to like thousands and millions of whatever females yearly, you now cross into the next threshold of like, yeah, estrogen and progesterone is something that like you have in pretty high levels. We start crossing into anabolics where you don't necessarily have that level of testosterone or that level of DHT regularly occurring. And then you just run that thing for 16, 20 weeks plus weeks. Like, you are going to wreak havoc on that system. And then not only are there side effects that you could deal with for the rest of your life, you also have to understand that there's going to be a lag time when your body goes back to baseline, goes back to just
Mm-hmm.
its regular spot to begin with. So if you're going into like, I want to compete and get on compounds, and you're already dysregulated to begin with because you had a poor diet and you weren't training and all these other things that like already have you dysregulated, and then you dysregulate yourself with male hormones, it's going to be a problem, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have an issue. Now, the other thing that you kind of touched on there is like after you kind of you turned pro and then you took your run of shows and you realized you weren't really ready for that. You took 2.5 years
Mm-hmm.
between competing before you were like, all right, it's time to pull the trigger and let's see what we did, right?
Yeah.
The thing that like again, kind of touching on what you said, men, we can like shorten that timeline quite a bit. Like men, if they wanted to, could compete every year. You could get on stage every single year. I don't necessarily
For the
think
most
that's the
part.
most ideal, but
Yeah.
for females, that is an even worse thing because like we have to go through many more phases to make sure that your body is regulated appropriately. So there's this, again, going back to the social media thing, there's this almost pressure of like, once you have competed one time, the question you're going to get the whole rest of your life: when are you getting on stage again? When are you getting on
Yeah.
stage again? When are you getting on stage again? So like, even just from that, like, even if they're not succumbing to like all the peer pressure of like drugs and that kind of thing, after you hear somebody ask you how many, like a million times, when are you getting on stage again, you might start to wonder like, when am I getting on stage again, and rush that process. So like, the fact that you took that long and allowed your coach to do his job for that long of a time period is another big, like, very self-aware thing of you, of like, look, I know I need to improve in this manner. So in those 2.5 years, what was it that like helped you make that much progress going from 21 to 24?
So I will say, like, losing as many times as I did really helped. So,
Sure.
like, as much as I would have liked to, like, not be in that place and, answer the question of like, oh, how many pro shows have you done? Because when people know that I'm a pro, sometimes they ask that, especially other pros. And like, up until last year, telling them like, I've done 6, but like none of them worked out. So don't look me up, please. Like that definitely helped in terms of like my just persistence and relentlessness to make sure that I don't make that same mistake again. Like you do something wrong or you fail enough times, and if you just keep getting the same result but you expect different results, then like that's a definition of insanity, right?
Mhm.
So I didn't want to continue showing up as the same, even though like yeah, versus show I would like improve slightly, or I would learn something new or something like that, but the result was the same. Like on paper, it was the same. So I really just focused on not letting that happen again. And, when I really also, my biggest thing was like learning and just educating myself more, not only on like the enhanced side of things, because that was new to me at that time. Because I hired him telling him, like, I obviously need to go this route. I want someone who is going to help me with that and educate me along in the way. And so, like, when I first started my first cycle, for example, I asked him, like, I want you to explain everything to me like I'm 5. Because I obviously, like, I'm a coach and I want to learn how to do this more myself. And, on top of other education and mentorships that I've done to achieve that. But also, just like for myself, I knew if I understood things more, I would have better buy in. I would be a better athlete and do better. That's what I tell my own clients too. Like, if you understand more because I'm explaining it, then like you're going to do better work. And so I just really focused on being a sponge and like learning as much as I can, really going all in to being as coachable as possible, because I knew that coming from where I did with my last coach, I was kind of coaching myself in a lot of ways. And because he just didn't give me a lot, like I would get very minimal responses, and like just it was very hands off because we had developed that relationship over several years, because he was the coach that I started with after my second show, or after my first show. So it was learning, like knowing that I had a lot to learn and dropping my ego, because so much of the time, especially if someone's been competing for a long time, even if they're a pro, they have a lot of ego, and that ego will hold you back. And so if your ego, I mean like you think you know everything, or you think you know what's best for your body. And while like, yes, everyone has a level of awareness on how their body works, but if you have failed a number of times and you haven't gotten the result you wanted and you've been trying really hard, then that means you don't know your body as much as you need to know,
100%.
as much as you might think. So just dropping that ego was really helpful for me. I got into During my 2021 season, I got into stoicism a lot, and I honestly, that helped me, reading the Daily Stoic and then getting more into just like other readings and stuff like that with that. Helped me develop just a mindset that was about more than just the past or the future, what I want to do, but just staying more present and accepting and appreciating the present moment. Like, yeah, I want to get on stage again, and I'm doing all of this to try to do better than last place, but the stage is not going to be there next month. It's going to be there when I'm ready. And to get ready, I need to do really well in the present moment. And so I just took every workout, every, meal, every check-in as like just trying to stay as present as possible, and also doing that in my everyday life, because after stepping off stage in 21, I realized I had a lot of like my life stuff that I needed to improve on. I had just gone over like 2021 in general. A lot of like things changed for me. I finalized my divorce at the time because I left at the end of 2020. I moved across the country to Texas, started at a new gym. I got my, I started full-time coaching. That was another thing. Cause I'd been coaching kind of on the side, and like up until 2021 when I started coaching full time. So it was just a lot of change in my life. And looking back, I probably shouldn't have prepped during all that, but to each their own. I still learned a lot. But then 2022, new coach, I realized like I needed to be done with the relationship I was in. I needed to like figure out my life as much as I could, because if I had my life in a better spot, then I knew that my future prep, but also my off season at that time, would also be a lot better. And I can't stress that enough. Like, don't prep, don't go into any like aggressive phase where like there's going to be timelines and pressures if your life is not settled. There's
Don't
not,
use it as an escape.
but like there's definitely better and worse times to prep. So
100%. Yeah, and like the two main takeaways from that is like you used one of the biggest drugs that anyone possibly can, which is fucking patience. like, like the secret here to every single pro that you have ever seen do really well at that level is they all utilized patience. They all took their time. And like, look, yes, we are in a sport filled with genetic anomalies. There are people who turn pro, win their first pro show, and go to the Olympia in a very short time period. Most of you watching this are not that person. And if you are, you already fucking know it, right? Like, if you have to ask, am I a genetic freak? The answer is no.
yeah,
And then the second thing that you did that you talked about there is like having all your ducks in a row outside of competing, right? Like, for the most part, people who want to compete, it's not that hard to get them to go to the gym. It's not that hard to at least get them to adhere to a diet 80 to 90% of the time. It's not that hard to get them to do cardio, those kinds of things. But what is difficult a lot of times for those people is dealing with all of the other things outside of it, because a lot of times we don't have control over those aspects of our lives. Like,
yeah,
the gym is something that everyone has control over, and like you can make yourself do those things. You can't control when someone in your life is fucking it up. You can't control when you're going through financial stress, when you're going through mental stress, when you're going through all these different things. And something that I've seen far too often that almost always ends in disaster is utilizing preps as an escape, right?
yeah,
And like, sure, look, I have done it. I have 100% gone through those time periods of like, everything's not going great right now. I need something to really focus on to get myself straight. And like, did it eventually pay off? Sure, but I probably would have looked a lot better, felt a lot better if I wasn't also already going through all those things to begin with. So,
mhm,
like, in those time periods where you are not getting on stage, this is your time to get all of those other ducks in a row. Get your finances in order, get your personal relationships in order, get your mental stuff in order, and like really lock those things in, so that when you have to shift that attention away from those things and really put yourself 100% into this bodybuilding thing, you can do it without all these other things over here burning to the fucking ground, and then you're left with nothing when you're done competing. I think that is an incredibly important thing that people just really don't pay enough attention to.
Yeah, and I think for me, like a big part of that time off and settling my life and things was just becoming more self-aware and more just like okay with myself. I realized like I had been just like going in various aspects of my life. Like being in a relationship like at from basically graduating high school to like that 2021 like relationship post divorce. And so I really looked at myself after that, and I realized like I need to just spend time by myself in order to like be the person I need to be for myself, but also to be the type of person that, is deserving of like love from like friends, from a significant other. And
Yep.
like that was one of the best things I could have done for myself instead of constantly seeking validation or seeking out, you know, whatever it is, because then that brought me to Austin, my boyfriend, my partner now. And like just now having gone through my prep with him and his support, that was like such a huge game changer in just like how any other prep had gone with other significant others in my life. Because of just like when you're with someone who really allows you to be the best version of yourself and empowers you to be that, not the version they want you to be, it's just such a different experience. And like I've been through a lot with in terms of like types of relationships while in prep, and like I promise it is worth taking that time to really like be your own best friend and like fall in love with yourself and develop a level of self-love that it does not depend on you looking a certain way or having a certain thing or having a partner or whatever. Because if that's what's happening, like it's it's generally going to get worse in prep.
Yep.
And because like you said, like our capacity just decreases in prep usually, especially if things in our life are not in the place that they need to be.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, being in a relationship in bodybuilding is a make or break thing. 100%. There's not really an in between with those. Like, you're either going to be with someone who's not going to understand it at all and like resents everything that you're doing, and then at the end of the day, like when you're finally done, they're like, "Oh man, that was great. I'm so glad it's done." Or you're going to be with somebody who, like, yeah, sure, it's not fun to be the person that's not in prep having to support that person because of how selfish you kind of have to be, especially towards the end of things. But they're at least understanding of like, hey, this is a short time period. It is now not my time to focus on me. It is my time to focus on my significant other and support them through this process. And if you don't have that and you're just with someone who's completely ignorant to that, like, you're going to struggle. It is going to make this thing a lot harder. And even if that's not like a relationship with a significant other like that, it's just your friends or your
Mhm.
family or whatever. Like, if you have a group, if any group of individuals that you have around you who are not supportive of what you are trying to do, you are going to struggle. You are going to have a much harder time with that, because there's going to be times where like you need to rely on those people because it's going to suck. And if they're not there and not understanding, they're going to be like, well, why are you complaining about this? Like, they're just not going to connect with it. They're not going to understand that, like, oh, this is really difficult. Like, until you've been through it, you don't know. You just can't know. Like, most people have at least tried to diet at some point or another, but there's a difference between like getting in shape and looking fairly good and like getting to body fat levels that you should be at on stage.
Yeah.
They're not the same thing. They're completely different aspects. And like, sure, there are things that are in common, but like the level of like mental insanity you kind of have to go through in order to get yourself to that point is something that most people cannot connect with, right?
Yeah.
And if you're going through these things and you're not the most fun person in the world and people haven't been through that, they're just not going to get it. They're not going to be able to connect with you and be able to support you through that. Now, just to kind of reel it back to what we were talking about earlier, when it comes to prepping females, timelines have to be a lot different, right? And like, from my experience, and I'm curious to see if this is something that you see as well, is when it comes to females, we almost have to like push them harder and pull them back harder in
Mhm.
pretty much every aspect, right? Of like, I'm going to have to push you really hard for a short period of time, and then I'm going to pull you back for a significant amount of time. So we have to have like a lot bigger ebb and flow because of all those other aspects that we've already discussed here. Of like, we have to try our best to keep your normal hormonal cycle in shape, because that is actually going to help us get in shape. It's going to help you keep the amount of tissue that you need. It's going to help you get leaner. It's going to help you not feel absolutely insane. So the more we can kind of like swing those things back and forth when it comes to food, when it comes to cardio, when it comes to training, when it comes to drugs, like the more we can swing those things back and forth and go, cool, we're going to go 6 to 8 weeks and push you really fucking hard, and then I'm going to give you 4 to 5 weeks of kind of pulling back and chilling. So that timeline has to be a little bit different. Is that something that you've noticed with yourself and other females as well?
Yeah, I don't typically go, multiple weeks at a time without some sort of break, especially once we're like in the depths of prep. What I tend to do more of is like just a little shorter of a timeline in that. And so that like not, you know, 3 weeks of pushing or 8 weeks of pushing and then 4 weeks of pulling back. It's honestly like some people don't have that type of time.
Right.
What I'll typically do more of is like, after a long period of pushing and we haven't had any periods of pullback, well, I'll do kind of like a trial of pulling back, whether it's a day, 2 days, 3 or 4 days. Sometimes it kind of extends just based on someone's response. But it really depends on the response, and that's why I rely on data a lot. So I have
100%.
like a really intensive data sheet that I have my clients track their data on, and so like I can see not only like what their weight does the next day after a refeed or a cardio break or something like that, but what their like what how that corresponded to the hours of sleep they got, what they trained, what their step count was, what their stress level was, if they were on their cycle or off cycle or something like that. Because those things all play a really big role, and I look at all of those things when deciding, okay, this person needs to pull back or this person needs to push a little bit harder. um, and sometimes too, like a big one is just digestion, looking at digestion and making sure that that's happening, because much of the time in prep sometimes we lose sight of what is going to continue our digestion being regular. Like, for example, a lot of, if you're experiencing a stall in weight loss, but you're being perfect with every single thing, it might be that, like, oh, you have too much fiber because you're having like the fiber amount that you'd have during with like this higher average calorie amount versus what your calorie amount is now, which is a lot lower, but you kept your fiber higher. So, like, it's just one example of like making sure everything is accounted for and that we're not missing anything. That's why we take so much data.
Yeah, and like those were just some generic numbers I was throwing out just to give
Yeah.
examples. And like I think the main point to get across there is like for like obviously this is not the case with everyone, but for the most part, when a guy starts prep, I can just kind of like run him all the way in, right? And like sure, there's going to be time periods where we need to pull back a little bit, let them rest, and deal with stress, but for the most part, it is relatively linear, right? For
Yeah.
females, it's not quite the case, right? Like you said, like we're gonna have to push you for X period of time, see how the body responds, get the data, and then go, cool, we need a little bit of a maintenance period, right? We need to pull you back. We need to take you off some cardio. We need to pull out some fat burners for a little bit, maybe take the drugs out if they're in play, and run those for shorter periods of time, utilizing them for what they're actually meant to be used for, which is muscle retention and strength, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily like using it to cut the body fat, that sort of thing. Like that's what fat burners are for. The androgens are there for muscle tissue, right? It's there to help you be able to continue training while we don't have a lot of food in the system. So
Yeah.
that was kind of more or less what I was getting at there. Now, as far as the enhancement side of things, like we don't have to get into specifics and that sort of thing because like that's not what I want this to be about. But do you typically like with your females, do you have them go through like shorter stints of like we're going to go 4, 6, 8 weeks and then we're going to come off and let it rest for a little bit and then we'll run it again? Do you set those timelines up to kind of correlate with certain parts of prep, or how do you typically do that?
Yeah. So it really depends on the person and what their off season was looking like as well. If they, some people are set up where like they're kind of doing a growth phase that rolls into a prep. So like maybe they had like an 8 week growth phase cycle and then we come off for the first portion of prep. And so the first portion of prep, maybe the first half, they're more or less natural. We're utilizing food, cardio, just everything else to make and see progress. But then that gives us a lot of time when food isn't super low, it's just a little bit lower. And you also drop off a little bit of inflammation that might have accumulated from the cycle. And then when the time comes and we need to add something like an anabolic for muscle maintenance and retainment, then we can, because it's at a good time to. And so generally that's one way that I'll do things. Not everyone is rolling a growth phase into a prep, but some people do. And even the people that aren't, generally, like, I'll kind of start with a pre-prep phase where we're just dialing things in, maybe like reducing cardio a little bit, even to kind of desensitize or resensitize you to cardio when we add it back. And that pre-prep phase is oftentimes natural, and then the beginning of prep is also doesn't need drugs for it to work.
Right.
I think for especially females, since they are less resilient, and we do need to take care of that in a more like close-eyed fashion than you would with men. It's just more in their best interest to like wait until you really need it before adding that kind of thing in. And I
Right.
think this happens. I see it in client or in athletes, especially pro athletes, but or just like higher level athletes with coaches who do push drugs a little bit more aggressively, which is coaches are trying to have a look during prep that looks more impressive and keeps the athlete motivated. So to each their own, however you want to do that. But what I find is like that just extends the duration that they're on a drug just for vanity,
That's a
right?
great point.
It's okay to look flat. It's normal to look flat. We don't need to add a drug to make you pop in the middle of prep when you're still 10 to 12 weeks out.
Yep.
In my opinion, I'd rather you be really flat because that's going to lead to more fat loss, or it's going to lead to fat loss naturally anyway. And then adding in the drugs when we absolutely need them so that we can limit your exposure, because that's the goal with
Right.
females, like limiting the exposure as much as we can and having like a truly minimal effective dose when it comes to drugs.
Yeah, 100%. Because that's such a great point that you touched on, and I'm glad you brought it up. And like obviously when we utilize compounds, there is a visual aspect to like what those things can do, and like especially depending on the division you're looking at, the individuals may need to look harder on stage, right?
Mhm.
And compounds will do that. Like that's kind of part of what they're there for, right? So it makes sense to wait until later in that prep, in the last fourth of your prep, to start adding in some things that we don't want to run for 12, 16, 20 weeks, whatever it might be. So I think the biggest thing to point out here is typically with a female, I'm going to want a longer period of time in prep so that we don't have to use all these other compounds in order to elicit the response,
Yeah.
right? And I think another big point there that you touched on was just because you started prep doesn't mean compounds have to be involved, right?
Yeah.
And that's for men too. Like
Mhm.
the thing is like just because prep started doesn't mean we automatically have to hop on gear. You can lose fat by doing cardio and being in a deficit. It's gonna work. I promise you. And
Yeah.
it is not my job to what's the word I'm looking for? It is not my job to appease you by
Mhm.
making you look good at 10 weeks out or whatever. It is my job to make sure that the day you step on stage is the best you've ever looked, period, plain and simple. Right. And
Mhm.
that leads back to the social media thing of like, yeah, I mean, as a coach, I want to be able to post some cool shit online because it does help, and it does help us get more clients. But
Mhm.
what I care about at the end of the day is what result did we get on stage, right? Plain and simple. If I have you looking amazing at 10 weeks out and we shit the bed on the day of the show, I did my job wrong. Like that I fucked up, and I'm not a good coach just because I made you look good at 10 weeks out and everybody's like, "Oh my god, he's going to be amazing at this show," or she, what, like that doesn't matter. That's all BS. Like you're here to do well at a show, not look good on social media. Like 100%. And then uh we haven't really talked about it yet, but something that like stands out in my mind through this conversation is there are a lot of things that we can utilize for females that are not androgenic that
Mhm.
we can like deploy within your prep phase that's not going to have an impact on your hormonal profile that will get us the response we want, right? So like maybe that whole first half of your prep, you touch nothing that has anything to do with anabolic. And then the last fourth or half or whatever, you start to dab your toes into that. But it's like cross your T's and dot your I's at the beginning, doing everything else that we've already discussed before you start going down that rabbit hole, right? And thinking, oh, well, I have to run Anavar and Winstrol for 16 weeks in order to look as good as I can. It's like, no. Like,
No,
not
you
unless
don't.
you want to deal with ramifications for the next year.
Well, and it also like it's less effective the longer you use it
Yeah.
too. And so like you have to think about that. I think one of the biggest like lessons you can learn out of like this type of conversation if you're listening as an athlete is just like the comparison game will absolutely like fuck you if you
Mhm.
let it. And so that goes back to like especially when you're in a prep, but really any phase of being an athlete, really if you feel your mind start to wander and like look at someone and compare yourself to others or wonder like, well, why don't I look like that at 10 weeks out or whatever, you have to know that there's so many other variables that you're like that side of your mind is not considering when they have that immediate judgment and comparison thought. Because like there's kind of two sides of your mind. There's like the side that just has the thought, and then there's the side that can actually like view that thought and take it in and be like, huh, that's not actually true. I don't need to be thinking like that. Like, I don't need to look at, so and so and wonder why I don't look that level of lean yet. I just need to focus on me. And especially like as a natural athlete versus an enhanced athlete, or as an athlete who maybe is doing their first enhanced prep versus someone who's been doing it for 10 years. Like, there's going to be differences no matter what that are real. And then there's also differences that are not real, like people editing their photos and people lying about where they're at, or people's coaches lying or editing photos. Like there's so much out there.
Yep.
So you might as well just like keep your blinders on and focus on yourself and not focus on anybody else.
And the reality of that situation is like if you are one of those people who is like constantly in your head looking at other athletes, you don't know how many of those people are looking back at you going, wow, that person looks amazing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you don't have the capability to be like completely truthful with yourself of like, oh, I actually look pretty good right now. Like
Yeah.
when you're in that prep mindset, you're always going to analyze every little small thing and go, I don't look great right now. I don't look great right now. But like I can tell you every single one of my preps, there are pictures I can go back and look at and go, wow, I really thought I was behind there. And it's like, no, I was doing pretty fucking good. Like
Yeah.
the prep goggles, that you have on during that time is you're never going to think that you're amazing. Like, and the thing of it is having been around some of the top athletes in the world, every single one of those guys and girls does the same thing. Every single one of them goes, I'm not as good as I am. I'm not as good as I am. Like just because they get on a pro stage or the Arnold stage or the Olympia or whatever doesn't mean that they don't doubt themselves as well. We're all human, regardless of what your genetics are and what you look like. There are doubts that creep into your mind. And you go, oh, I'm not as good. I need to keep doing X, Y, Z. When the reality of it is you need to shut the fuck up and just listen to who you have entrusted, right? And hope that you did your research and you're working with someone good. And
Well, there's levels to it. Like you
100%.
just said, like the people at a higher level that you're comparing yourself to, they have people that they're comparing themselves to, whether that's like a higher level pro, another pro,
Absolutely.
or just even themselves in a past version. I think a lot of people shoot themselves in the foot as a competitor because they're constantly just they don't have the ability to stay present. They're either in the future in like what's going to happen that they can't control yet, or in the past on like where I used to be or where I once was or what I should have done XYZ. So just going back to the power of presence and staying present in like what you're doing, what your job is. You can't solve the world's problems in a day. You can't solve all of your problems. You can't get stage lean in a day. So just focusing on like the thing you are doing right now and the things that are within your immediate control, including your thoughts and your mindset, and just leaving it at that. Don't think about anything else.
Yeah, I think I heard Guy Cisternino say this on a podcast that at one point when he was working with Aceto told him, "Hey, we're at the point now in your prep where you just need to focus on the next hour. Worry about what's in front of you for the next hour." And at
Yeah,
first it
that
didn't really
helps.
click with him. At first it didn't like click with him, and then after a while he started to realize like, "Oh yeah, if I start worrying about what's coming tomorrow, I start getting into panic on all these other things." So it's like focus on just what you have to get done right now. And the
Yeah.
other thing there with the comparison thing is like you don't know what that person is doing
Hmm.
at X number of weeks out that could potentially mess them up the day of the show,
Yeah.
right? just because someone looks good at 10 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, does not mean that they're going to show up the day of the show looking the way they need to. There are
Mhm.
so many variables and so many things that can happen during that time that could completely ruin that physique, right? Like, I can't tell you how many number of people that I've been like, holy shit, that guy's going to win this show. And then they show up to it and it's like, oh, what happened? Right.
Yeah.
Whether it's that they over pushed themselves and they over dieted, or whether it was just a poor peak, or like you said, edits and stuff
I
that
got
they weren't
stressed
able to
out.
take to stage.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you need to have a rational like thought process with yourself to go like, cool, yeah, this person looks really good and I'm going to use that as motivation to push myself to make sure I'm doing well, but I'm not going to go, well, I'm not as good as that person, so I suck. Right. Like, not
Yeah.
turning it into something that defeats you versus motivates you and pushes you forward. Right.
Mhm.
And just because you look, again, the same thing on the opposite side, just because you don't look that good at 10 weeks out does not mean that you're not going to look amazing come day of the show. Because look, I can make drastic changes in somebody in 3, 4 weeks if we have to. I can make super drastic changes by like, yeah, look, dude, something went wrong. We're going to have to push this thing. And a lot can happen in a very short period of time with the right amount of effort. Right. So,
Mhm.
like, just because you feel behind, or maybe you actually are behind, doesn't mean come day of the show that you're not going to come together well. So, just like Rachel said, focus on what's in front of you. All right, I have another session of cardio to do today. I got to go in and train this today. I got to eat this meal right now. I got to get my steps in. Focus on those things versus like making yourself anxious trying to think about the things that are to come in the future. That's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, and it is the worst thing because like the effects of stress on the body are huge
Stress
and
will
they're
ruin you.
hugely underestimated too.
Mm-hmm.
So like I've watched this in myself, like going through my 2019 prep, which was like the year that kind of like was the year before the end of my marriage. Like there was a lot of stress that year. And there would be times where I would feel like, oh my God, I look great. I look the best I've ever looked. And then a blow up would happen. The next day, I would look like, I had just added 4 or 5 weeks back to my prep or like taken away, right? I would be puffy, inflamed, just like water retaining water. And so, like, stress is just such an important aspect. And if you don't know how to manage your stress and manage like your reactiveness and responsiveness to stressful situations or to being overwhelmed or whatever, then your prep is going to be really hard to like push through because the more you stress, the more you'll probably stall and not make progress or not make as much progress. And then you'll want, or your coach, especially if they don't know you're stressed out, they'll want to push you harder. And just the act of pushing harder through an already stressful time where you're stressing yourself out and you're becoming anxious, those things are just compounding and making you worse and worse by the day.
Worst possible decision.
Yeah.
100%.
And so like focusing on like having good stress management before prep obviously is like a big help, but as things come up and create a different response than you're used to when it comes to stress, just like learning to take them in and let them go, not judging every single little thing, especially if you are stalling. Instead of judging yourself or worrying about what's happening, tell your coach, this is what I'm worried about. What do I do? What do you think? And a good coach is going to like give you the peace of mind and remind you like you're right where you should be. Don't you worry about the scale, let me worry about the scale. It's something I tell my clients a lot.
100%.
It's like if you worry about it, you're just even more worse off. So just let me be the judge of your progress and you just do your job, which is
Yep.
following your
And the leaner you get, the more stress is going to affect you. Like,
Mhm.
so the closer you get to that show, like if you have not implemented some like stress management techniques, you're going to deal with it even bigger. You're going to have bigger swings the leaner you get. And again, going back to like, if you did your due diligence and actually made sure that your coach is someone who knows their shit and knows what you're supposed to do, they're going to understand that, like, all right, cool, this person is super stressed out right now. In order for us to take a step forward, we need to take 2 steps back. We need to let you relax. We need to give you some food for a bit. We need to take a couple of days off cardio. Maybe you just need to sit down and not train for a couple of days. Maybe there's some things we need to implement in there that's going to help you. that might be counterintuitive in that moment of like, well, I'm 4 weeks out. Why would I take a couple of days off? Well, it's because you have pushed yourself to a point where if I continue to like redline you, it's going to blow up in our face and it's not going to make us better. So it's like that. I think that is the ultimate like testament to whether a coach is good or not, is understanding when it's time to push harder and understanding when it's time to pull back. Like if your coach knows how to do that, especially individual to individual, you are going to get far more progress in an off season and a maintenance phase and a prep than you will with anyone else. If they can manage you and your stress, you are going to come out on top at the end of the day. Maybe the first prep doesn't go great because they're still learning you, but over time, you give them enough time and they figure out how to manage you better, you are going to come together better than you ever have, plain and simple.
And that comes from you communicating too as the athlete. I think a lot of athletes, like, they might hear that and be like, "Well, my coach isn't reading my mind the way that these people are saying they should." But like, we can't read your mind, but we can get to know you over the
Yeah.
course of time. So that's why I would much rather have someone in a full off season, like a year plus before starting a prep with them, because I get to know them as a person. I
Mhm.
understand their weak points, their strengths, both physically and mentally, and we get time together for like them to get to know me and my style, and me to get to know them and acclimate to them and like give them what they need, because every client needs something different.
Yep.
Every client is going through something different. And single mom with two jobs over here trying to get a prep going versus you know 23-year-old recent college grad that has a cushy job and doesn't have kids or a dog, like their preps are totally different.
Mhm.
And so just like you have to communicate what you're going through, what you need, what you're curious about, what your questions are. All of those things are super important to communicate in order to have a coach
Yep.
that, if your coach gives a shit, they'll get to know you through that communication, and then they will be able to perform in that way of like knowing when you need that break or knowing when you need to push.
I'm sure you're the same way with this, but at this point, my clients have heard the word communicate and communication more times than I think they have in their entire life. Like at this point, they're like, "God, he said that word again." But yeah, communication is like literally everything with this job. If you're
Mhm.
not communicating effectively, and this is something that I've touched on with other people, but like communication doesn't mean just like word vomit. Communication doesn't just mean like let me spill my guts to you and have you treat this like a therapy session. It's being effective with your words and getting your point across that is going to help me be able to make a decision on what we need to do going forward. Right? So like I don't need to know the ins and outs of why your relationship is going poorly. I just need to know that something is bad in your relationship that's causing you some mental stress, and this is what we need to do to go forward. That's it, plain and simple. Like you're not paying me enough to be your therapist. I'm sorry, but like
Yeah.
the learning how, and that's another aspect to like having spent a lot of time with a coach, is like you have to learn how to communicate with that individual. We have to learn how to communicate as a relationship to make sure that I am being effective in getting you the information that you need, and then I'm taking that information and understanding what it actually means. I'm
Mhm.
understanding far beyond just the words that you said and going, cool, that's what this person is telling me, but this is what it means over here, and this is how it's affecting us, and this is what our game plan is going forward. It's like learning that relationship and the ebb and flow of like how people handle things and how people communicate things is so important with this whole thing. But
Yeah.
we're coming up on an hour here at this point. So, like, is there anything that you can say to kind of summarize some of these things that we've talked about here? Any major points that you want to drive home before we finish up?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of great points were covered, but the biggest thing for me is just like really get to know yourself and be really clear about who you are and what your purpose is as an athlete and why you're doing this. Take your time on figuring that out. And the closer you get to, like, you'll never fully figure it out. Like, we're all going to be figuring out for the rest of our lives. But
Mm-hmm.
the more you get to just know yourself and show up as like the best version of yourself and doing the hard things and the fun things to get to that point, setting boundaries or communicating something that is vulnerable or whatever, the more you do that, the better athlete you can become. And like the less stressed or anxious of an athlete you are. So again, the better athlete that you can become.
Yep. And like I said earlier in this conversation, patience is the number one secret that the
Yeah.
best in the world have, is like being patient and understanding that this isn't just something that everybody runs into and just immediately has success. Like even the best genetic people in the world don't always get things handed to them. You have to be patient and understand, if you keep putting a positive effort forward, keep showing up day in and day out for yourself, something is going to pay off. It might not be the way you think it's going to be, and it probably won't be the way you think it's going to be, but that positive effort is going to be rewarded in some aspect. So be patient and put in the time and reap the rewards by learning how to, of course, my brain is going to blank on this word now. Delay gratification. There we go. Like
Yeah.
learn how to delay that gratification and understand that, like, if you are dipping your toes into the bodybuilding world or even just a transformation, it is not Amazon Prime. It's not going to be here tomorrow.
Yeah. And don't be afraid of losing too.
Right.
Like, no, we don't want to compete to lose. I don't recommend that, but don't be afraid of just like going for something even though you don't know if you're going to win.
Yep.
And then because
So,
whatever you do, whatever happens, you're going to learn from it and that's going to make you better in every way.
yep.
So, making
You always
mistakes, losing, it's just a part of the process.
Yep, you always learn more from your losses than you do your wins. You will reflect back more on a loss than you will a win, at least from my standpoint. But Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to plug like your coaching and all that kind of stuff right quick so people can find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. The best way to reach me is there, probably. Rachel Sedwick, IFBB. And then I do have my coaching team, Refined Strength Coaching. I have two coaches working with me, Daraja and Jess. So we're all accepting clients right now. And the podcast, the Refined Strength podcast, is also on all the platforms. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I just have to say before we finish up, it's been really cool to see you kind of like create your own thing and build your own brand. And it's been really cool to see your success over the last few years since we met each other. And it's really awesome. So I am very proud of you as far as that's concerned, of like what you've built and what you've been able to create for yourself. So for
Thank you.
anyone out
Right
there
back
that's
at you.
looking, huh?
I said right back at you. You building your thing and
Thank
doing
you.
your thing. It's cool to see. It's cool to see anyone just like clearly doing what they love to do
Yeah.
and just getting better at it over time and figuring it out.
Yeah, and I think a big testament to that too is like we have a lot of the same mutual friends, and we all like support each other in that manner of like,
Yeah.
there is a system of people of like, when I have something wrong, I know I can go to these people and kind of figure some things out. So, but yeah, thanks so much for coming on. If anyone is looking for a coach who truly gives a shit about the people that hire them, Rachel is your lady. But otherwise, we will see you guys next time. Have a good one. Thanks for watching.